A single breath. Slow. Controlled. Measured. Through the high-powered scope, Lieutenant David Ghost Hawthorne exhaled, his heartbeat syncing with the movement of his crosshairs. 2 kilometers away, beneath the eerie glow of Xiphos 7's twin moons, a Zephyrian warlord stood, laughing. Arrogant. Untouched by the slaughter his forces had unleashed. David's gloved finger hovered over the trigger. Wind speed calculated. Humidity adjusted. Bullet trajectory perfected. The warlord raised a clawed hand, signaling his troops forward. He had no idea he was already dead. David smirked. 1 shot. 1 kill. A whispered exhale. Bang. A moment of silence. Then chaos. The warlord's head detonated, a mist of violet blood splattering across his elite guards. Panic. Confusion. Fear. The once invincible Zephyrian forces turned in all directions, searching for the unseen specter that had just turned their leader into a corpse with no face. David reloaded. Time to teach the galaxy why humans should never be underestimated. The air above Xiphos 7 was thick with smoke, the acrid stench of burning wreckage and scorched flesh mixing into a suffocating haze. Alien bodies lay sprawled across the battlefield, some human, most not. The Galactic Council's forces were in full retreat, their once proud formations reduced to desperate, scattered groups trying to escape the advancing Zephyrian warriors. Lieutenant David Ghost Hawthorne lay prone on a rocky ledge, his body still, his breathing controlled. Through the high-powered scope of his sniper rifle, he watched as the enemy moved without fear, their massive, armored frames striding forward with the confidence of an unstoppable force. A Zephyrian commander stood at the front, barking orders in his guttural tongue. His heavy, segmented armor glowed faintly, designed to absorb energy-based attacks. He wasn't worried. None of them were. The Galactic Council had proven itself weak. The humans, even weaker. David exhaled, aligning the crosshairs just above the warlord's elongated skull. 2 kilometers. Wind speed negligible. Humidity adjusted. Gravity on this moon, slightly weaker than Earth's, but well within his calculations. He squeezed the trigger. A single suppressed shot cut through the chaos. The warlord's head snapped back as a neat, half-inch hole appeared between his eyes. A beat of silence followed before his body crumpled, heavy armor clanking against the dirt. A ripple of confusion spread through the Zephyrian ranks. Soldiers froze. Eyes darted around, trying to locate the source of the shot. David chambered another round. A lieutenant rushed to the fallen warlord, touching the corpse as if to confirm what his eyes refused to believe. Another shot rang out. The lieutenant collapsed, his chest cavity torn open. Now came the panic. Zephyrians turned in all directions, scanning the ridgelines, but their scanners were useless. Their technology could track energy signatures, heat sources, projectile trajectories, but not him. Not a man who had spent years learning how to become nothing more than a ghost. His comms crackled in his ear. "Hawthorne! Do you copy?" It was Captain Ielzara, the council officer in charge of the human forces. She never used his name. Until now. "Still breathing," he replied. "You're supposed to be in retreat with the others. What are you doing?" David adjusted his aim, tracking another high-ranking Zephyrian, this one directing reinforcements toward a flanking maneuver. He fired. The target folded, a hole where his throat used to be. "Winning," David said flatly. A frustrated hiss came through the comms. "Fall back now. The Council's forces are retreating. The battlefield is lost." David scanned the ridge opposite him. Lost? No, not yet. Not if he could help it. He keyed his mic. "Negative. Your forces are retreating. Mine is right where he needs to be." A guttural roar echoed below as the Zephyrians scrambled to reorganize. Their warlords were gone, but their numbers were still overwhelming. They wouldn't remain confused for long. David had minutes, maybe less. He shifted position, crawling back from the ledge. Staying in one place too long was a death sentence. He slung his rifle, moving down the rocky slope with practiced ease, boots barely making a sound against the dry terrain. His earpiece crackled again, this time a different voice. Sergeant Decker. A fellow human, one of the few who respected what David did. Ghosts, tell me you're not sticking around. No promises. Decker cursed. They're pulling back to the LZ. You should be on that dropship. David reached a new position, setting up behind a jagged rock formation. The Zephyrians were regrouping, their discipline kicking in. They'd learned not to stand in the open. He spotted a communications officer, one of the few carrying a mobile command unit. He needed to go. David steadied his rifle. Give me 60 seconds. You don't have. David pulled the trigger. The comm officer collapsed, his equipment sparking. The Zephyrians lost their secure link. More confusion. That was his window. He moved again, sprinting low to avoid detection, shifting through the shadows of the uneven terrain. Shots rang out behind him, wild, desperate. They still had no idea where he was. His legs burned as he climbed a new vantage point, setting up for another strike. He peered through the scope, searching for the next target. That's when he saw them. 4 Zephyrian soldiers, moving unlike the others. Faster. Controlled. Their armor sleeker, their weapons compact and efficient. Elite hunters. They weren't panicking. They were hunting. David exhaled slowly. They had adapted quicker than expected. That was fine. He had to. He switched to armor-piercing rounds. Headshots wouldn't be enough now. As he adjusted his aim, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A new figure, standing atop a wrecked council transport. Larger than the others, armor adorned with jagged spikes, its black plating shimmering under the moonlight. Warlord HFY, the leader of the Deathbringers. David smiled. Finally. HFY surveyed the battlefield with a slow, measured confidence. He was waiting, daring David to take the shot. David's finger hovered over the trigger. A voice whispered in his earpiece. Ghost. Time's up. David exhaled. Not yet. He moved back from the ledge, disappearing into the dark. The night stretched endlessly over Xiphos 7, the dim glow of distant moons barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. David moved like a shadow, slipping between jagged rock formations, his breath steady, his movements calculated. His rifle was slung tight against his chest, his boots pressing soundlessly into the dirt. He knew better than to stay in one spot for too long. The enemy would be watching, learning, adapting. He had seen them, the hunters. They weren't panicking like the rest. They were scanning, tracking, methodical. Zephyrian elites. That meant his window of free kills was closing fast. Crouched behind an outcrop, he wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced through the scope, studying the battlefield. The confusion from his last strike was wearing off. The scattered Zephyrian troops had found new leadership, regrouping into tighter formations. He had hit them hard, but they were still overwhelming in number. His earpiece crackled. Decker again. Ghost, I don't hear an exfil request. You still playing cowbell out there? David kept his voice low. They're adapting. They've sent specialists. Silence for a beat then. Shit. Yeah. David adjusted the rifle, tracking a Zephyrian officer coordinating regroup efforts. He was heavily armored, issuing sharp, clipped orders to squads forming a defensive perimeter around their remaining warlords. Smart. They were locking down weak points, limiting his angles. Didn't matter. His scope settled, breath leveled. The shot rang out. The officer crumpled, his command tablets slipping from his claws. Instant reaction, troops pivoted, weapons raised, but they didn't know where to fire. David was already shifting, crawling backward over uneven terrain, keeping his profile low. A sniper's war wasn't about speed. It was patience, deception, control. He wasn't fighting their army. He was fighting their minds. His instincts flared. He ducked an instant before plasma fire ripped through the rock above him. They had his position. David rolled hard to the right, slinging his rifle over his back as he sprinted low through the ravine, weaving between natural rock formations. Sharp, deliberate movements, never in a straight line. He didn't have time to pinpoint the shooter, but the angle told him enough. The hunters had found him. The second shot missed his shoulder by inches, superheated air singing his armor. He veered left, boots skidding against loose gravel as he dove behind a broken hull of a downed council transport. His heart pounded, but his breathing remained steady. A voice echoed from the rocks above, guttural, laced with amusement. "No more ghosts. I see you." David smirked, resting his back against the wreckage. Good. That meant they were getting cocky. He unhooked a reflective drone from his belt, activated it, and tossed it high into the air. It hovered mid-flight, projecting a flickering heat signature just beyond his cover. A shot fired. They took the bait. David moved. Low, fast, efficient, he flanked left, circling behind a jagged ridge where the shot had come from. The sniper was still adjusting, recalibrating. His first mistake. David lined up his shot. The hunter barely had time to register the threat before a kinetic round tore through his visor. One down. David slid into cover, reloading. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The remaining Zephyrians spread out, abandoning tight formations. Smart. That made them harder to pick off but also more vulnerable to an isolated kill. A voice, deeper, commanding, cut through the commotion. "You fight alone, human." "Why? Your kind scurries like rats. No pack to save you?" David exhaled slowly. Warlord HFY Vexel. The leader of the Deathbringers. He was addressing him directly. David tapped his mic. "Didn't know you cared." A rumbling chuckle. "I do not. I simply wish to know, why delay death?" David smirked, watching the warlord through his scope. He stood tall, unshaken, baiting him. He considered taking the shot, but something held him back. Too obvious. HFY Vexel was playing a game too. If he missed, they'd triangulate his exact location. He wasn't about to fall for it. Instead, he shifted focus. A Zephyrian sharpshooter perched just above HFY Vexel, covering him. David squeezed the trigger. The body slumped forward, tumbling down the rock face. HFY Vexel tilted his head, as if considering. Then, in a cold, measured voice, "Ah. You are not simply delaying. You are hunting." David didn't respond. A sniper's war was as much psychological as it was physical. Let them wonder. Let them question. A second later, plasma fire rained down around him. He darted between cover, repositioning before they could zero in. The air burned hot, dust kicking up in thick clouds around him. They were committing more resources now. Good. That meant he was in their heads. His earpiece flared to life. Ilzara again. "Hawthorne, the dropships are leaving. If you're not at the LZ in 2 minutes, you'll be declared Kia." He slid into a new position, scanning for another shot. "Tell them not to hold their breath. I did not authorize this suicide mission." David picked off another Zephyrian, this one carrying what looked like a sensor jammer. That confirmed it. They were actively trying to track him now. He had rattled them more than they wanted to admit. Ilzara's voice sharpened. "You think this changes anything? You think a handful of kills will make the Council see humans differently?" David watched the enemy scramble. "No. Then why stay?" He considered the question. He could have left. Could have retreated with the others. But something about the way the Zephyrians carried themselves, the way the Council dismissed humanity as irrelevant, it wasn't just strategy anymore. It was proving a point. He checked his ammunition. 6 rounds left. That would be enough. A sound behind him. A presence. Close. Too close. He turned fast, but not fast enough. A Zephyrian hunter slammed into him, sending him crashing against the rocks. David twisted, raising his rifle, but the alien's clawed gauntlet batted it aside. A second strike came, swift, brutal. He barely rolled in time. Close combat. Not his preferred fight. The hunter came at him again, dagger drawn. David dodged left, kicked low, knocking the alien off balance. He reached for his sidearm, too late. A strike ripped through his shoulder armor, tearing fabric and flesh. He gritted his teeth against the pain. The Zephyrian loomed, weapon raised for the killing blow. David pivoted low, grabbing a jagged shard of metal from the wreckage and driving it up, straight through the enemy's throat. The alien's body stiffened, gurgled, then collapsed. David staggered back, exhaling sharply. His radio flared again. "Hawthorne! You alive?" He wiped blood from his face, reloading his rifle. "Yeah." A pause. Then Decker's voice, dry as ever. "Bet it was ugly." David smirked despite himself, looking back toward the battlefield. "Oh, you have no idea." David crouched low against the ruined outcrop, blood seeping from the gash in his shoulder. His breathing was steady, controlled, but he could feel the sting of the wound settling in. The Zephyrian's blade had cut deeper than he realized. He flexed his fingers, still responsive. Good. Losing function now would be a death sentence. The battlefield was changing. The enemy had stopped fighting in panic. They were moving deliberately, methodically. They weren't hunting blindly anymore. They were closing in. He could hear their footsteps, distant, careful. The Zephyrians weren't brash soldiers anymore. They were predators now. David pressed his back against the cold rock, letting his heartbeat slow. The hunters had made their first move. He had taken one of theirs, but they wouldn't send lone attackers anymore. They had learned. Now they would coordinate, flushing him out with precision. His earpiece crackled. "Decker. Ghost, I don't like how quiet it's gotten over there." David wiped the sweat from his forehead, gripping his rifle tighter. "Yeah. Me either." A voice echoed through the canyon, low, smooth, deliberate. "HFY Vexel. You are impressive, human. You fight alone, yet you stand against an army." David listened, his scope sweeping over the terrain. The warlord wasn't in sight, but his voice carried, calculated to sound just within reach. "A distraction? I will admit." HFY Vexel continued, his tone edged with something almost resembling respect. "You are a predator. A rare sight among your kind. I wonder, how long can you run before the hunt catches up?" David smirked, shifting his position to a higher ridge. He wasn't running. He peered through his scope, scanning the area. They were repositioning. Spreading out, forming a net. Smart. But not enough. He spotted movement, one of the elite hunters, perched atop a crumbling structure, scanning the shadows. David steadied his breath. He lined up the shot, adjusting for wind, angle, and armor density. A squeeze of the trigger. The round punched through the Zephyrian's head, snapping it back violently. The body slumped over the ledge. Silence. Then shouting. The others had seen it. David moved instantly, rolling back into cover. The ground where he had been seconds ago erupted in plasma fire, the air boiling with heat. They had waited for him to fire. They were trying to pin him down. He darted to the left, slipping into a narrow pass between jagged rock spires. If they boxed him in, he was dead. He needed to break their formation. Decker's voice came through again. "That shot yours?" David kept running. "Yeah. You pissed them off." "Good." He slid behind a broken transport, peering through a shattered viewport. 3 hunters advancing. He pulled the pin on a smoke grenade and lobbed it toward them. The thick white cloud erupted, swallowing them in blindness. Distraction. They would expect an attack from the side or behind. David climbed instead. Scaling the wreckage, he moved to a vantage point above them. The hunters emerged from the smoke, weapons raised, scanning for movement. He lined up the shot and took the one on the left. Armor-piercing round straight through the skull. The second turned toward the sound, too slow. David fired again. The third reacted fast, diving behind cover. David moved before the counterattack came, sliding down the wreckage and disappearing into the canyon's winding paths. Keep them chasing. Keep them guessing. Plasma bolts seared past him, splashing against the rock walls. They weren't shooting wildly anymore. They were directing him. Hurting him. He skidded to a stop. A figure stood ahead, blocking his path. Not like the others. Sleek armor, dark as midnight, a long blade resting against his shoulder. The Zephyrian moved with the fluidity of a seasoned warrior. No more hunters. An executioner. David exhaled. This was going to be up close. The Zephyrian tilted his head. Your kind dies at a distance. I wonder, can you fight when death is near? David didn't answer. The alien moved first. Fast. Too fast. David barely had time to sidestep before the blade sliced through the space where his neck had been. He ducked, rolling backward, drawing his sidearm. He fired twice. The Zephyrian twisted midair, dodging both shots effortlessly. The executioner landed, crouched low, ready for another strike. David holstered the gun. This wasn't a shooting fight anymore. The alien lunged again. David sidestepped, catching the motion just in time to deflect the strike with his rifle. Sparks flew as metal scraped metal. The force sent him staggering back. Too strong. He couldn't match this thing in raw power. David feigned retreat. The Zephyrian took the bait, rushing forward, blade aimed for a killing thrust. David dropped low at the last second. The attack sailed over him. He grabbed a jagged piece of shrapnel from the ground and drove it up, straight into the alien's thigh. The executioner snarled, twisting to strike again. David yanked the blade free and slammed the butt of his rifle into the alien's head. A second strike. A third. The Zephyrian staggered. An opening. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed the alien's own dagger and jammed it into the soft space beneath the helmet. The blade sank deep. The Zephyrian froze. Then collapsed. David stood there, breath heaving, blood dripping from his temple. His earpiece crackled. HFY Vexel. Impressive, the warlord murmured. You are not like the others. David wiped the blood from his cheek. You're damn right. A deep chuckle. Then perhaps it is time I hunted you myself. David adjusted his rifle and took off toward the ridge. Come find me, then. The ruined city stretched ahead, skeletal remains of alien towers casting jagged shadows under the pale glow of Xiphos 7's twin moons. David kept low, moving through the rubble, scanning for movement. The air was thick with tension, the silence unnatural. HFY Vexel was here. He could feel it. The Zephyrian warlord had been watching, waiting, letting his soldiers fall so he could study him firsthand. Now, there were no more intermediaries. No more foot soldiers. Just predator and prey. David wiped his gloved hand over the fresh cut on his brow. His body was running hot, adrenaline dulling the ache of earlier wounds. He checked his ammo, 3 rounds left. Enough if he played this right. His earpiece buzzed, Decker's voice cutting in. Tell me you're getting the hell out. David crouched beside a half-buried vehicle, adjusting his scope. Not yet. Decker sighed. I hate you. Noted. The connection went dead. David exhaled, shifting his rifle. He needed a vantage point. The upper floors of the collapsed buildings were unstable, but they'd give him sight lines. He moved fast, scaling the wreckage of a broken support beam, pulling himself up with careful precision. Dust crumbled under his grip, but the structure held. From above, he had a clear view of the ruined district. Wide streets choked with debris, toppled statues of some long-dead alien ruler. No movement. No sound. That wasn't good. Zephyrians never moved without noise. They weren't built for stealth, not the way humans were. If it was quiet, it meant he was the one being hunted. David shifted position, angling his rifle toward a collapsed archway ahead. Something was there. A faint shimmer against the stone, barely perceptible. A cloaking field. A test. David aimed slightly off, pulled the trigger. The round impacted a foot to the left of the distortion, a controlled miss. No movement. But the air changed, charged with something heavy. A deep, vibrating chuckle echoed from the ruins. Well played. HFY Vexel's voice murmured, smooth as steel. David kept his breathing steady. Wasn't trying to play. Another chuckle, closer now. You understand patience. Good. The others screamed when I hunted them. You do not. David didn't respond. He wouldn't play into the mind games. A shadow moved. Fast. To his right. He pivoted, fired. A decoy. A false heat signature, programmed to move like a real target. XY Vexel was experimenting. David adjusted. The Zephyrian was testing how he reacted, how fast, how precise. He was being studied like prey. That wouldn't last. He slung his rifle and moved, dropping from his perch just as a plasma bolt ripped through the space he had occupied. The moment his boots hit the ground, he rolled, breaking into a sprint. XY Vexel was fast, but David was unpredictable. He ducked into a shattered corridor, weaving through the debris, breaking line of sight. He needed to reset the battlefield, force XY Vexel to react instead of control. A whisper of motion behind him. Not footsteps. A presence. He twisted, drawing his pistol. A blur of movement, a massive, armored form surged from the darkness, claws slicing toward him. David threw himself to the side, barely dodging the attack. He fired mid-roll, 2 rounds center mass. The bullets pinged off XY Vexel's armor, barely scratching the plating. The warlord struck again, his gauntlet slicing the air where David had just been. Brutal strength. Faster than the others. David didn't try to fight strength with strength. He moved, weaving between fallen beams, forcing XY Vexel to shift angles. You are quick. XY Vexel mused, his tone almost amused. You understand the hunt. David reloaded. I understand a lot of things. XY Vexel stepped into the open, his dark armor reflecting the moonlight, jagged edges gleaming. You have earned my respect. Few can claim that. David smirked, lining up another shot. I'd rather earn your head. The warlord grinned, a slow, predatory expression. Then he was moving. A blur of motion, too fast, too direct. David fired, but XY Vexel dodged at the last second, the bullet grazing his shoulder. The Zephyrian lunged, closing the distance before David could recover. A clawed hand snatched David's rifle, twisting it free and hurling it aside. David reacted instantly, drawing his knife and slamming it into XY Vexel's side. The warlord barely flinched. Armor plating absorbed most of the impact. David rolled with the momentum, slipping under XY Vexel's next strike, dodging left as another clawed hand swung at his head. A kick, David lashed out, striking the Zephyrian's knee. The warlord staggered, but only for a breath. Then XY Vexel's hand closed around David's throat. Power surged through the grip. Not enough to kill. Not yet. XY Vexel studied him, his golden eyes narrowing. This has been exhilarating. David gritted his teeth, digging the blade deeper into the warlord's side. Glad you're having fun? XY Vexel released him, stepping back. Not an act of mercy. A test. A game. David coughed, regaining his stance. The warlord tilted his head. You are the first human I have fought who understands war as it is meant to be. Not cowardice. Not mass slaughter. The thrill of battle. David exhaled sharply, wiping blood from his lip. And here I thought you were just another dumb brute. XY Vexel chuckled. I will offer you something rare, human. Surrender. Fight for me instead of the council. I would see you as a warrior, not a footnote in history. David wiped sweat from his brow. Tempting. He stepped back. XY Vexel's eyes narrowed. David's hand flicked to his belt, pulling the pin on a high-impact flash grenade. It detonated in an explosion of white light. XY Vexel roared, momentarily blinded. David didn't wait. He ran. Not in retreat. In repositioning. Because now he had what he needed, an opening. David ran. His boots pounded against cracked pavement as he weaved through the ruins, heartbeats steady, breaths measured. He had seconds, maybe less. XY Vexel was blind, but not for long. A warlord of his caliber wouldn't be slowed for more than a heartbeat. David needed to get ahead. The city ruins stretched before him, skeletal remains of a civilization long gone. He sprinted toward higher ground, scaling a fallen support beam, pulling himself onto a fractured balcony. From here, he had an advantage. Height. Visibility. A sniper's throne. He slung his rifle forward and checked his last 2 rounds. Not much. But enough. A deep growl echoed from below. The kind that sent a chill down the spine of any soldier. Not anger. Not fear. Anticipation. David went prone, peering through his scope. HFY Vexel stood in the open, armor scorched from the flash grenade, his golden eyes locked on David's position. He wasn't searching. He knew. David exhaled slowly, crosshairs centered. The warlord raised his arms, claws flexing. Do you understand now? His voice was calm, amused even. You are not prey. You are not weak. I see you for what you are. David steadied his aim. A guy with a rifle? HFY Vexel grinned. A warrior. David pulled the trigger. The bullet streaked through the air, aimed for the exposed gap beneath the Zephyrian's helmet. But HFY Vexel moved. Not dodging, anticipating. The shot grazed his cheek instead of taking his head clean off. David didn't hesitate. He reloaded, adjusting for the warlord's speed. He wouldn't miss again. HFY Vexel took a step forward. Good shot. But not good enough. David fired again. The round pierced the warlord's side, finding a weak spot in the armor. HFY Vexel barely reacted. He tilted his head, as if considering the sensation of being shot. A wound. A mark of battle. You are the first human to give me one. David didn't move. He was down to his last bullet. HFY Vexel began walking, slow and deliberate. Closing the distance. You have earned my respect, the warlord said, voice steady. This is not a fight for survival anymore. This is a duel. David chambered his final round. You keep saying that. Starting to sound like a love confession. HFY Vexel chuckled, rolling his shoulders. A predator preparing for the kill. You mistake my words for weakness. I do not seek your death. I seek a true test. David lined up the shot. That's nice. He fired. The bullet slammed into HFY Vexel's knee joint, the weakest point in his armor. The warlord staggered, weight shifting as his leg buckled. David was already moving. He wasn't waiting for the next attack. He dropped from the balcony, rolling as he hit the ground, drawing his combat knife mid-motion. HFY Vexel was off balance for a fraction of a second, enough. David drove the blade into the warlord's throat. The impact reverberated up his arm. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to hurt. HFY Vexel grabbed David by the chest plate, lifting him off the ground with brutal strength. David twisted the knife deeper. The warlord grinned through the pain. Yes, he whispered. That is what I wanted to see. David ripped the blade free and kicked off the warlord's chest, landing a few feet away. He gripped the knife tight, blood dripping from his hands, his or HFY Vexel's, he wasn't sure. The warlord stumbled, one hand pressing against the wound in his throat. He didn't seem afraid. Only satisfied. David panted, muscles coiled. Waiting. HFY Vexel exhaled, stepping back. No more bullets. No more tricks. You would fight me with only a blade? David didn't answer. He adjusted his grip. The warlord nodded. Then let it be so. He lunged. David dodged left, barely escaping the crushing swipe of HFY Vexel's gauntlet. He ducked low, slashing at the Zephyrian's ribs, but the warlord twisted, catching David's wrist in a vice grip. Pain shot through his arm. HFY Vexel pulled him close, their faces inches apart. You will die well, Ghost. David drove his knee into the warlord's wounded leg. HFY Vexel snarled, his grip loosening. David wrenched free and slashed across the warlord's face. The blade cut deep, carving through the ridges of his alien skin. HFY Vexel roared, staggering back. David didn't let up. He moved fast, striking again. The warlord caught his arm. Too strong. Too fast. He yanked David forward, slamming him into the ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. HFY Vexel loomed over him, wounded but standing. Still standing. David rolled to the side just as a massive clawed hand came down, crushing the spot where he had been. He grabbed a fallen Zephyrian blade from the rubble. HFY Vexel laughed. You are relentless. David threw the blade. The warlord barely reacted, catching it midair with a flick of his wrist. Exactly what David wanted. Because it wasn't meant to kill. It was a distraction. David lunged, grabbed his fallen rifle, and swung it like a club. The butt of the gun smashed into HFY Vexel's head, full force. The warlord stumbled, dazed for the first time. David struck again. And again. The warlord fell to one knee. For the first time, HFY Vexel looked up at him, not as prey, but as an equal. David stood over him, breathing hard. Blood and dirt streaked across his armor. He raised the rifle one last time. HFY Vexel exhaled, smiling. Finish it. David hesitated. Then he lowered the rifle. HFY Vexel chuckled, even as blood dripped from his mouth. A warrior's mercy. David stepped back. No. A lesson. He turned, walking away. Behind him, HFY Vexel let out a deep, rumbling laugh. The warlord's voice echoed after him. I will remember you, Ghost. David didn't look back. He just kept walking. Mission complete.